Chapter 17, Lesson 3. The North Wins. Main idea. Thanks to victories beginning with Gettysburg and ending with Richmond, the Union survived. One American Story. Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain left his job as a college professor and took command of troops from his home state of Maine. His description of the aftermath of one battle shows how soldiers got used to the war's violence. A voice from the past. It seemed best to put myself between two dead men among the many left there by earlier assaults, and to draw another crossfire for a pillow out of the trampled, blood-soaked sod, pulling the flap of his coat over my face to fend off the chilling winds, and still more chilling the deep, many-voiced moan of the wounded that overspread the field. Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, quoted in the Civil War. Chamberlain is best remembered for his courageous actions at the Battle of Gettysburg. In this section you will read about that battle and the others that led to the end of the Civil War. The road to Gettysburg. In September 1862, General McClellan stopped General Lee's northern attack at the Battle of Antietam, but the cautious McClellan failed to finish off Lee's army, which retreated safely to Virginia. President Lincoln, who was frustrated by McClellan, replaced him with Ambrose Burnside. But Burnside also proved to be a disappointment. At the Battle of Fredericksburg, Virginia, in December 1862, Burnside attacked Confederate troops who had dug trenches. The bloody result was 12,600 Union casualties. This disastrous attack led General Lee to remark, "It is well that war is so terrible, we should grow too fond of it." Lincoln replaced Burnside with General Joseph Hooker, who faced Lee the following May at Chancellorsville, Virginia. The result was yet another Union disaster. With half as many men as Hooker, Lee still managed to cut the Union forces to pieces. However, the South paid a high price for its victory. As General Stonewall Jackson returned from a patrol on May 2nd, Confederate guards thought he was a Union soldier and shot him in the arm. Shortly after, a surgeon amputated the arm. Jackson caught pneumonia. On May 10, Lee's prize general was dead. In spite of Jackson's tragic death, Lee decided to head north once again. He hoped that a Confederate victory in Union territory would fuel Northern discontent with the war and bring calls for peace. He also hoped a Southern victory would lead European nations to give diplomatic recognition and aid to the Confederacy. The Battle of Gettysburg. In late June 1863, Lee crossed into southern Pennsylvania. The Confederates learned of a supply of shoes in the town of Gettysburg and went to investigate. There, on July 1st, they ran into Union troops. Both sides called for reinforcements, and the Battle of Gettysburg was on. The fighting raged for 3 days. On the rocky hills and fields around Gettysburg, 90,000 Union troops, under the command of General George Meade, clashed with 75,000 Confederates. During the struggle, Union forces tried to hold their ground on Cemetery Ridge, just south of town, while rebel soldiers tried to dislodge them. At times the air seemed full of bullets. "The balls were whizzing so thick," said one Texan, "that it looked like a man could hold out a hat and catch it full." The turning point came on July 3rd, when Lee ordered General George Pickett to mount a direct attack on the middle of the Union line. It was a deadly mistake. Some 13,000 rebel troops charged up the ridge into heavy Union fire. One soldier recalled bayonet thrusts, saber strokes, pistol shots, men going down on their hands and knees, spinning round like tops, ghastly heaps of dead men. Pickett's charge, as this attack came to be known, was torn to pieces. The Confederates retreated and waited for a Union counterattack. But once again, Lincoln's generals failed to finish off Lee's army. The furious Lincoln wondered when he would find a general who would defeat Lee once and for all. Even so, the Union rejoiced over the victory at Gettysburg. Lee's hopes for a Confederate victory in the North were crushed. The North had lost 23,000 men, but Southern losses were even greater. Over one-third of Lee's army, 28,000 men, lay dead or wounded. Sick at heart, Lee led his army back to Virginia. Battle of Gettysburg. A monument stands today near a ridge at the Gettysburg battlefield. Labeled the high water mark of the rebellion, it shows how far Confederate troops advanced against Union lines. There, on July 3, 1863, the South came closest to winning the Civil War. The fighting began on July 1st. When a Confederate force captured Gettysburg, Union defenders took up new positions in the hills south of town. The next day, Confederate troops attacked across a wheat field and peach orchard in an attempt to seize the hill called Little Round Top, but Union forces held their ground. July 3rd was the decisive day. Lee, having failed to crack the side of General Meade's Union line, attacked its center. In an assault that came to be known as Pickett's Charge, some 13,000 men charged uphill across an open field toward the Union lines along Cemetery Ridge. Union soldiers covered the field with rifle and cannon fire. Pickett's Charge was a Confederate disaster. America's history makers. Ulysses S. Grant. General Ulysses S. Grant was an unlikely war hero. Although educated at West Point Military Academy, he was a poor student and showed little interest in an army career. With his quiet manner and rumpled uniform, he often failed to impress his fellow officers. Yet on the battlefield, Grant proved to be a brilliant general. Highly focused and cool under fire, he won the first major Union victories of the war. Grant was willing to fight Lee, even if the costs were high. He told his generals, "Wherever Lee goes, there you will go also." Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee seemed destined for greatness. In his crisp uniform and trim, white beard, Lee was a dashing figure on the battlefield. Born to a leading Virginia family, Lee was a top student at West Point and won praise for his actions in the Mexican War. General Winfield Scott called him the very best soldier I have ever seen in the field. Lee did not want to fight the Union, but he felt he had to stand by Virginia. "I did only what my duty demanded," Lee said. "I could have taken no other course without dishonor." The Siege of Vicksburg. On July 4, 1863, the day after Pickett's Charge, the Union received more good news. In Mississippi, General Ulysses S. Grant had defeated Confederate troops at the Siege of Vicksburg. The previous year, Grant had won important victories in the West that opened up the Mississippi River for travel deep into the South. Vicksburg was the last major Confederate stronghold on the river. Grant had begun his attack on Vicksburg in May 1863, but when his direct attacks failed, he settled in for a long siege. Grant's troops surrounded the city and prevented the delivery of food and supplies. Eventually, the Confederates ran out of food. In desperation, they ate mules, dogs, and even rats. Finally, after a month and a half, they surrendered. The Union victory fulfilled a major part of the Anaconda Plan. The North had taken New Orleans the previous spring. Now, with complete control over the Mississippi River, the South was split in two. With the victories at Vicksburg and Gettysburg, the tide of war turned in favor of the North. Britain gave up all thought of supporting the South, and in General Grant, President Lincoln found a man who was willing to fight General Lee. Sherman's Total War. In March 1864, President Lincoln named General Grant commander of all the Union armies. Grant then developed a plan to defeat the Confederacy. He would pursue Lee's army in Virginia, while Union forces under General William Tecumseh Sherman pushed through the deep South to Atlanta and the Atlantic coast. Battling southward from Tennessee, Sherman took Atlanta in September 1864. He then set out on march to the sea, cutting a path of destruction up to 60 miles wide and 300 miles long through Georgia. Sherman waged total war, a war not only against enemy troops, but against everything that supports the enemy. His troops tore up rail lines, destroyed crops, and burned and looted towns. Sherman's triumph in Atlanta was important for Lincoln. In 1864, the president was running for re-election, but his prospects were not good. Northerners were tired of war, and Democrats who had nominated George McClellan stood a good chance of winning on an anti-war platform. Sherman's success changed all that. Suddenly, Northerners could sense victory. Lincoln took 55% of the popular vote and won re-election. In his second inaugural speech, Lincoln hoped for a speedy end to the war. With malice toward none, with charity for all, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and a lasting peace. In December, Sherman took Savannah, Georgia. He then sent a telegram to Lincoln. I beg to present you as a Christmas gift the city of Savannah with 150 heavy guns and about 25,000 bales of cotton. Grant's Virginia campaign. After taking Savannah, Sherman moved north through the Carolinas, seeking to meet up with Grant's troops in Virginia. Since May 1864, Grant and his generals had been fighting savage battles against Lee's forces. In battle after battle, Grant would attack, rest, then attack again, all the while moving south toward Richmond. At the Battle of the Wilderness in May 1864, Union and Confederate forces fought in a tangle of trees and brush so thick that they could barely see each other. Grant lost over 17,000 men, but he pushed on. Whatever happens, he told Lincoln, we will not retreat. At Spotsylvania and Cold Harbor, the fighting continued. Again, the losses were staggering. Grant's attack in June at Cold Harbor cost him 7,000 men, most in the first few moments of battle. Some Union troops were so sure they would die in battle that they pinned their names and addresses to their jackets so their bodies could be identified later. In June 1864, Grant's armies arrived at Petersburg, just south of Richmond. Unable to break through the Confederate defenses, the Union forces dug trenches and settled in for a long siege. The two sides faced off for 10 months. In the end, though, Lee could not hold out. Grant was drawing a noose around Richmond, so Lee pulled out, leaving the Confederate capital undefended. The Union army marched into Richmond on April 3rd. One Richmond woman recalled, exactly at 8 o'clock, the Confederate flag that fluttered above the Capitol came down and the stars and stripes were run up. We covered our faces and cried aloud. Surrender at Appomattox. From Richmond and Petersburg, Lee fled west, while Grant followed in pursuit. Lee wanted to continue fighting, but he knew that his situation was hopeless. He sent a messenger to General Grant that he was ready to surrender. On April 9, 1865, Lee and Grant met in the small Virginia town of Appomattox Courthouse to arrange the surrender. Grant later wrote that his joy at the moment was mixed with sadness. A voice from the past. I felt like anything rather than rejoicing at the downfall of a foe who had fought so long and valiantly, and had suffered so much for a cause, though that cause was, I believe, one of the worst for which a people ever fought, and one for which there was the least excuse. I do not question, however, the sincerity of the great mass of those who are opposed to us. Ulysses S Grant, Personal Memoirs. Grant offered general terms of surrender. After laying down their arms, the Confederates would return home in peace, taking their private possessions and horses with them. Grant also gave food to the hungry Confederate soldiers. After 4 long years, the Civil War was coming to a close. Its effects would continue, however, changing the country forever. In the next section, you will learn about the long-term consequences of the Civil War.